William, I just want to go back to more about the East India Company. 1599. Paint us a picture as to how did they come into being, what kind of ships first went to India, and how over a period of time the aims of this private company changed.
So, 1599, as I said, Shakespeare's writing Hamlet somewhere in just downriver from the Globe Theatre. Those of you that have been to the rebuilt Globe can picture sitting by the banks of the Thames. Shakespeare lives about half a mile downstream. And if you were to walk from there across London Bridge, 20 minutes, you would find yourself in a place called Moorgate Fields, which in those days wasn't a rather kind of grim-looking tube station, but was actually, as its name implies, fields. And in the middle of that was an old half-timbered Tudor building called the Founders Hall. Now, this was not founders as in founding fathers. This was founders as in brass founders, guys who made bells and anchors. And the man behind the founding of the company was a man called Customer Smythe. Customer because he'd been for the last 10 years in charge of the London Customs and made a fortune out of that. But he was a classic sort of Tudor entrepreneur. He'd made his first fortune by the age of 25, importing currants from the Greek islands. He then made another third fortune just before this by founding something called the Levant Company. And the Levant Company was a group of 30 very rich Tudor merchants and ship owners who got together, pooled their capital, and started buying spices from Aleppo and from Cairo, and a little bit from Venice. And they did very well for about 10 years, 15 years. And then in 1595 and 6, their whole business model was put to nothing by the fact that the Dutch realized that you can just sail around the Cape, go to what we would now call Indonesia, particularly the island of Run, where nutmeg came from, and buy all this stuff at a fraction of the price, cutting out all the Arab middlemen who were adding their commissions onto the price of it by the time it reached Customer Smythe in Cairo. And so he appeals to the patriotic spirit of the businessmen of Tudor London, Elizabethan London, and he calls them all to Moorgate Fields, and he has a very clever idea in his head when he does this. He tries out a new business model that had only been tried out 3 times before, something that's very obvious to us today and probably affects almost everyone in this room in one way or another, but which was a new invention at the time. And this is the joint stock company, the corporation. And the difference between the joint stock corporation and the sort of effectively guild system by which he had run the Levant Company was that rather than a closed board of 35 investors, all of whom were involved in the running of the company, with a joint stock company, you have a small board, and then you keep the investment completely separate, and anyone can invest. So as well as the big ship owners putting in £1,000, £500, and so on, you have, at the end of the list of subscribers, these people who describe themselves as haberdashers or skinners or vintners. In other words, small London businessmen with small businesses. And they're contributing £5, £10, £15. And they don't expect to be consulted about whether a voyage will take place or not. They just know that they will get a share of the profits if it's successful. And they sail off to Indonesia. It doesn't initially look as if it's going to be a great success because they've just got as far as Dover when the wind dies down and there's this strange summer calm. And the expedition just sits bobbing off the white cliffs for a month and everyone comes and laughs at them and waves from the... But they sail off to Indonesia. They make it to the island of Run, and there they see a Portuguese ship coming the opposite direction, and as they're all ex-pirates, they just board the Portuguese ship, transfer the contents into their hold, and sail back to London, where they sell the contents for £1 million. And that's enough to make all their fortunes. It does literally begin as an entirely piratical exercise. They make no bones about this. And a lot of the seamen who had invested and who actually staffed these ships had been with Drake and Raleigh, literally raiding, pirates of the Caribbean. Think Jack Sparrow. There's this sort of world. Initially, they are always one step behind the Dutch. The Dutch have already been there. They've got better financial instruments. They can raise more money. They've got bigger ships. And in 1630, they actually beat the English out of the East Indies, which means Java, Indonesia. And there's this famous sort of face-saving treaty whereby the English hand over to the Dutch the island of Run, which is then considered to be the most valuable property in the world, where all the nutmeg comes from. And as a face-saving device, the British get given a sort of muddy island in the Hudson River called Manhattan, which, of course, isn't a bad investment in the long run, but at the time is considered rather a humiliation. And by default, the English fall back on the textile trade, the second best option. And that turns out to be their lucky break, because this is just the moment when the Mughals are rising up, when the same sort of eye for aesthetic beauty which informs the Taj Mahal and those incredible Mughal textiles that we see in the miniatures, that caught guidance towards huge beauty, which reaches its peak at the period of Shah Jahan, genuinely changes the nature of textile design and so on, and makes these textiles world-beating, incredibly beautiful objects that everyone in any culture, whether you're a Mexican, a Frenchman, a Dutchman, or indeed somebody in China or the East Indies, wants to buy this stuff. And the East India rises up, this company rises up on the back of the Mughal Empire. And then it's only in the 1750s that the whole thing changes gear and turns from an empire of business into the business of empire.